Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I am your host, Charles Musgrove of the Answers That Count podcast. Thank you for joining us for another great show. And we're going to bring you some more great information today. We're going to talk about current economic times, what's going on in the markets, what's going on in the economy. We're seeing it. The restaurants we go to, the grocery stores we go to. We're going to talk inflation. But before we jump into that, I'm going to ask a favor of you. Please hit the subscribe button. That way more people will get notified. They'll see the podcast that we put out. So please hit the subscribe button. You can also hit the notification button. That way when we post something, you'll be notified to go watch the video. So, or listen to the podcast. So hit subscribe and notify. And today we've got Professor Joe back with us today. Thank you again, Professor Joe.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right, we're going to talk. This is good stuff. You know, one of the good things I enjoy about our show is that we really, I think we bring some great information. We make the discussion about economics, I think, lively and relevant because it is, a lot of people think of economics as boring and they're talking about statistics and numbers and macro and micro and, you know, those things, they may sound boring and not fun, but what we do is we bring it to life because we apply what could be old principles, tried and true principles. We apply it to what's happening in the news today. You can open up your newspaper, or you can go to the grocery store and feel the effects of this economic stuff, and we bring it to life. We explain it in terms that I think I can understand it, and I think everybody else can understand that as well. So thank you for bringing economics to life, Professor Joe.
Yeah, well, thanks. Well, just like the laws of nature, gravity, and things like that, we're subjected to the laws of economics every day. People are impacted by economics every single day of their life. And that's part of the reason I love it so much is because it is so relevant. All you got to do is look out your window and a lot of times just look in the mirror and you're doing economics every day.
Exactly. And heck, when you get in your car, when you go fill up at the gas station, when you go to drive to the grocery store, we feel the effect of economics too. And one of the big things that when I mentioned filling up with gas and going to the grocery store, going to your restaurant, we're seeing today, and what we see in the news is this discussion of inflation. So we've had talks about, we've discussed that in the past, and we've applied it to data that has come out. You know, we talked a couple of weeks ago about the non-farm payroll and about unemployment and about how many people were employed, the workforce. So another great topic that we've talked about and that's real life economics is the inflation. So let's talk about inflation.
Yeah, inflation is one of the two so-called evils of macroeconomics. When I tell my students about macroeconomics, I say that, there's two problems we need to worry about. Inflation and unemployment. Those are the so-called evils, two things that a little bit is okay, maybe even desirable, but like many things, too much of a good thing is bad. So when either one of those start to get above what we call normal or sustainable levels, now we have some problems and we've got some consequences that everyday people have to start dealing with. And yeah, the numbers that just came out the other day about the inflation rate hitting high since 2008. That's got some good news and some very bad news in there. So let's see if we can unravel this a little bit. The good news is a lot of that inflation is coming from just a few sectors of the economy. So we see a huge increase in car prices, especially used cars, because a lot of new car production has been halted because of computer chip problems. You haven't been able to get as many chips as we're trying to make cars. So we literally have a whole bunch of unfinished cars just sitting around, which is then going to shift consumer demand from new car to used car. So we've seen 2 months in a row now, huge increases in used car prices. We've also seen increases in rental cars and airlines and energy. So it doesn't take a genius to figure out when you drive by the pump, it seems like every day the number gets bigger.
Yeah.
So now that is bad news. I mean, if you're trying to buy a car, if you're trying to rent a car, if you're trying to fill up your car, then that's bad news for you. Also airlines, and you needed to mention airlines. But on the good side of things, if you're not trying to buy or rent a car, and if you're not flying on an airplane, then you can actually, walk away from a little bit of the inflation. Or to say that differently, this inflation isn't going to hit you quite as hard as if you were in those markets. Now,
Right.
obviously, if you have a car and it's driving really well, it's still going to cost you a little bit more to put some gas in there. But in the grand scheme of things, that's fairly tolerable. So we don't have this 5% every price in America is going up. That's not what the inflation index means. The inflation comes from a variety of different sectors. So we need people to realize that as well.
Yeah, let's we talked about the headlines. Let's put up a couple of those headlines. Let's go to the inflation headlines, John. Annual inflation soars to 5%. So you mentioned the largest jump since 2008, and we got one more headline. So these are U.S. inflation is highest in 13 years. So we see that we've talked about it. We've discussed it before it happened, and the fear of inflation, and you had the Fed talking about inflation wasn't a concern. At some point, it becomes a concern, and we've used terms like is it overheating? Are we getting too much inflation? And just like you said, too much of a good thing is not good. So,
Yeah,
are
and
we,
the other thing to keep in mind is the historical precedent here. It's one thing to say, yeah, highest in 13 years, but let's remind ourselves what happened 13 years ago. The inflation rate peaked in 2008. I forget the exact month, but it was relatively late in 2008. And then what happened immediately thereafter? Well, that's when the Great Recession really
right?
unfolded.
That was the financial
That's when the
market
housing
collapse.
market burst, and that's when we had all kinds of chaos. So, there is reason to believe that inflation was going up on a very consistent basis, and it would have kept going up. But the recession unfolded, and the inflation rate came right down, which it normally does during a recession. So there's really no strong signals that we're going to enter a recession. So part of the concern right now is, unlike 2008, when that recession was cut off, or excuse me, the inflation was cut off a little bit, we don't really seem to believe that there's a recession around the corner. So it's likely that inflation is going to continue for a while. Now, the other thing we need to keep in mind is not historical, but what's going on right now. The way I like to create an analogy for people is, we're coming out of a recession. We're not officially in a recession right now. We're in a recovery period. And just like when you personally get sick, you don't get well in an instant. I mean, you're not sick one day and then the next morning you wake up, like, I'm 100%, I'm back to normal. Well, our economy right now is healing itself, and we've got a lot of moving pieces in our economy, and some are adjusting rather slowly. We see massive supply chain blocks in areas like lumber and automobile production that I mentioned before. So we're having this very difficult time readjusting after the pandemic. Now, I know the pandemic's not officially over, but we're getting close to it being over. So we've got a lot of adjustments going on right now, and it's going to take a while for things to settle. Now, that doesn't mean we can just, throw away all of our worries and say, oh, it's all going to be fine. I mean, there is true concern here, but, we do have to recognize that we're in this very difficult adjustment process, and we need to let some things play out.
Right. And one thing that, and we've talked about this before, but it's worth bringing up again, the relationship between the employment market and inflation, and the flooding of the amount of dollars by the federal government into the economy. All that is, some of those are signs of what's happened. Like we still have so many people that are not entered into the workforce. So our workforce pool is still low relative to other times in recent history. And with the amount of money that the federal government has put into the economy, all of that says, okay, maybe the incentives are not in the right place. Maybe there's too many dollars in the market that's chasing too few goods, which is kind of a layman's definition of inflation. So until some of those things change, we're not going to see that inflation slow down.
Probably not. I think it's going to take several more months for things to kind of settle, for some of these supply blockages to get unblocked, for the labor market to settle a little bit, and for people to continue to readjust from their pandemic way of doing things to a non-pandemic way of doing things. You know, we still have a lot of adjustments there with just everyday decisions. I know a lot of people that I know are in this very awkward period of time where they were at home 100% and now they're being asked to come back. Well, it's kind of awkward timing because they've got young kids at home
Right.
and they've been used to caring for their young children. And now their boss is saying, hey, you got to come back in. They're like, well, I'm not sure what to do with my kids because I haven't been able to plan in advance. A lot of summer camps still aren't happening. So, you know, what a lot of parents used to do is enroll their kids in a bunch of summer camps to keep them occupied, and then they would go to work. Well, some of those camps are going on, but a lot of them aren't because of the pandemic. So parents are really caught in this difficult position. So, you know, again, we've got a lot of adjustments going on here. They're going to just cause this whole process to probably be slower than what it normally would be.
Right. Plus, you know, that back to the correlation between what we're seeing in inflation and the employment numbers, and you also see another tie in there is a lot of the states have mandated minimum wage increases, and you see a lot of big companies, they're moving to going ahead and bumping up minimum wage before the mandated increase. And one of the news headlines we saw come out this week was Chipotle. So Chipotle agrees to raise all of their minimum wages to $15 per hour. So, you know, what happens when you do that? Well, they have to increase their prices to cover the cost of that minimum wage increase. And all of that is, you got the increases in cost, increases in what they pass on to the consumer. All of that is also kind of I would say a micro look at the result of inflation.
Yeah, it's part of what's going on as individual prices adjust across markets. That will lead to certain price increases. So yes, we're seeing this in the restaurant industry, where if you are going to raise wages but yet still want to maintain some kind of profit level, well, you need to raise your revenue in a similar proportion. It doesn't have to be exactly one for one. But if your costs go up and your revenue stay the same, well, then your profit margin gets squeezed or maybe goes negative. So therefore, if you want to maintain a reasonable profit level, you've got to raise your revenue. And how do you raise revenue? We either sell more things at the old prices, which is kind of hard to do sometimes, or you have to raise prices to sell the same number of things as you did before, but at higher prices. So there's two different ways. You know, price times quantity is your revenue. So either one or both of those have to raise if the whole equation is needed to raise.
Right. I saw this, and John, flash up the detail of what was in one of the articles. This the guy that wrote the article, I know he's not an economist, but I'll let you be the judge since you are the economist. How accurate is this description? Basic economics doesn't change because a political movement wants it to. It's a finite world with finite resources, and when you move one number, it affects other numbers. This simple rule of economics cannot be overcome. In order to put more money into one thing, you first have to give it up. And in order to balance the sheets, more money has to come in from somewhere to compensate.
Yeah, again, just like the laws of gravity, there are certain laws of economics that we can't get away from. Supply and demand, when the price goes up or something becomes more expensive or more requires more effort or energy, people are going to do less of it. So we have these basic, we call them the laws of demand and supply for a reason,
Right.
because we all have to abide by them. I mean, you just can't wave your fingers and say, well, we're just going to get rid of that wage and just artificially make it higher, and then no other changes will happen in that market or in the economy. It just doesn't work like that, right? I mean, you just can't go out to your backyard and say, you know, I'm just going to wave my hands and make it rain. I mean, there are certain forces of nature and for certain forces of economics that we just have to adhere to. And you know, as much as we would like to live in a world where we can just make believe, and we can maybe live in a Hollywood world where we just make it happen, we can just give people raises without any consequences. That's not the world we live in.
True. So As I think Chipotle and we've seen other large companies, they're ahead of the curve on giving those raises, and they're able to get away with a lot of those because they are big companies. As you see the state mandates come into play in different states, then states are going to be forced, businesses are going to be forced to increase minimum wages. So you're going to see more of this rather than less of it.
Oh, absolutely. You're going to see more of this because, like you said, more and more local governments, state governments are increasing these wages. And even if it doesn't come from government, just like the Chipotle example, a lot of businesses are taking upon themselves to get ahead of the curve, so to speak. They see that this legislation is probably coming. They're trying to get ahead of it and say, you know what, let's just, if it's going to happen, let's just go ahead and do it ourselves now. So that they're doing it for a variety of different reasons, and consumers are absolutely going to pay for some of that.
Right. And there's one other display I want to put up, John. You go to the this is an older survey, but it's a survey of economists. I think there was close to 200 economists that were surveyed, and this was back when a lot of the federal legislation to raise minimum wage was discussed, and the question was, should the federal government increase the minimum wage to $15 per hour? And the answer to that was 74% of those responded no, that they should not. And uh, give me your thoughts on that. I can think of the reasons they do that or the reasons the economists gave that answer is because maybe it violates so many of the fundamentals of. So, Joe, a lot of these states that they have mandated increases in minimum wage. So, what's your here we see where the polling for close to 200 economists said they don't agree with the mandated minimum wage, at least on a federal level, up to $15 per hour. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I have two predominant thoughts. Number one, the minimum wage is really just a trade-off. You have to recognize that by artificially raising a wage above what we call an equilibrium wage, and I'll get to that in a second, is a trade-off in this sense. You are helping the people who keep their job and keep the number of hours. There's no question about that. When somebody goes from $10 an hour to $15 an hour, and they keep their normal number of hours, that's going to give them a bigger paycheck. They're absolutely better off. What you have to recognize, though, is the trade-off that either some people lose some hours, so their total paycheck is not going to be helped, or what is most likely to happen, the trade-off is other people aren't going to have jobs. So it's going to create more unemployment because the employer says, I just can't afford to hire 3 people. I can only hire 1 or 2. So now we've got 1 or 2 people who would have had a job at $8 or $9 an hour who aren't going to have it. So it's a trade-off. The other thing, and I think this is a big thing when you're talking about federal legislation, when anything happens at the federal level, that means every person in the labor market from coast to coast, north to south, is going to get treated the same. And we all know that there are huge differences in our country. We like to say here, when you're in the South, you do things our way. We got a way of doing things. Well, also, we have an economic way of doing things. We know that when you go to New York City, you're going to pay higher prices than you do in Tallahassee, Florida,
Right.
or an urban center versus a rural place of the country, or one place versus another. So when we pass legislation at the federal level, it is literally one size fits all.
Right.
And that runs into a lot of problems because one size fits all doesn't work very well. And I would even argue that one size doesn't fit well at the state level. I mean, that's why I was opposed to the state amendment in Florida that slowly increased the minimum wage, because once again, the labor market in Tallahassee, Florida works differently than the labor market in Miami Beach
Right.
in every other place, or even rural Leon County versus the city of Tallahassee in
Right.
Leon County. So we have to be very careful about these one size fits all type of policies because that just doesn't work very well.
Doesn't it also, and I know you're a free market type of guy, doesn't that also fly in the face of some other fundamental economic theories where you have this government intervention, and we've seen that so many times in the past where on a grander scale where you've had government intervene to try to fix one problem or to drive one solution or to drive one outcome, that those that it leaves in the wake are just it just creates a mess of the other stuff.
Well, I think even deeper than an economic issue, to me, it's a moral issue because let's just role play a scenario. Let's suppose that I'm a person who's trying to find a job and I knock on your door and I say, I'm willing to work for $6 an hour. I know what I'm getting myself into. This is a voluntary agreement. I'm willing to give up some salary because I'd rather have six versus zero.
Right.
And you say, yeah, I'd love to hire you for six. So you and I, as moral economic agents, come to an agreement. But yet the government, whether it's a federal government or local government, says, no, 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 you can't do that. So it's interfering with our personal decision making because you may say, yeah, I'd love to hire you at six, but this law requires me to pay you 12 or 15 or whatever the law says. So sorry, I can't do that. And I say, well, sure, I'd be willing to work for 15. And you say, well, I'm sorry, I'm not willing to hire you for 15.
Right.
So then you and I have to walk away. And to me, that's a real moral issue in terms of somebody else telling you and I what we can and can't do on a strictly voluntary basis.
Yeah, Joe, that's a great point, and one that you don't hear very often. But man, I tell you what, that really hits home.
Yeah, and this is really what economics is about. It's not necessarily a moral science, but there are certain moral aspects of economics. And the most important thing that we like about capitalism and a market approach is that you and I are equal moral agents because we both have the ability to say, no, thank you. If you're offering a service or a product that is either I don't like, I get to walk away. If your price is too high, I get to walk away. I can't be forced to buy, and you can't be forced to make me buy, or you can't be forced to sell it. That's the beauty of a capitalist system is all participants have that ability to say, no, thank you, and to walk away. And when we interfere with that, not only do we cause economic problems, but again, we cause moral and ethical problems as well.
Joe, let's end up on one final point. Give me your thought on we've heard this is in the real early stage, but we've heard this discussion now on a federal level about universal income or universal basic income, where the government pays a base income to people whether they're working or not. How many rules of economics does that violate, and what's the likely outcome of that?
Well, I think it violates all the moral and economic rules that we talked upon with these other things. So one thing is who's going to pay for that? So if you're going to give somebody income to stay at home and not work or only work a little bit, and you're going to have to get somebody else to pay for that. So who's going to pay? Who's either going to volunteer to pay for that? Probably not very many people.
Right.
So who are you going to force? So now what do we have? You're going to extract money from some part of the economy. You're going to take it from some people and you're going to give it to others. Once again, what are the morals? What are the ethics there? And then what are the economic consequences? My biggest concern about any kind of basic income, whatever you want to call it, there's a lot of different names out there, is you have to be very careful not to destroy the incentive to have somebody improve their lot in life. Because if you give them a basic income that's going to cover all of their required necessities, that's probably as far as they're going to go.
Right.
And you want to be careful not to destroy the incentive for that person to make themselves better off, to either go get more education, go get more skills, do something better, do something more efficiently, whatever the case is. Our society, both economically and morally, is built upon people responding to incentives. And when people have the incentive to improve themselves, they will. And if you take that incentive away, you're really going to have a lot of problems.
Yeah. Great point, man. We covered a lot of great topics today. Stuff that you see in the news. This is basic, fundamental economics that we're seeing lived out in front of us. We feel it in our pocketbook. We see it on the newspaper. We see it in the news. Whatever form of news that you take, we see it. It's real. thank you so much for bringing that to life and explaining it like nobody else can. So, Professor Joe, another great show. Thank you.
Thanks. Great to be here.
All right, good show. Thank you for joining us on another great show of Answers That Count. I'm your host, Charles Musgrove. Hit the subscribe button.